Long before written history, before kings carved their names into stone, before empires rose around rivers and cities, before the first clay tablet was pressed with a stylus to record a debt, or a harvest, or a name, people across the ancient world began doing something that, in the long quiet of retrospect, seems both utterly inexplicable and somehow deeply familiar. They lifted stones from the earth, heavy stones, in many cases impossibly heavy stones, stones that required the strength of dozens or hundreds of hands, stones that had to be quarried and shaped and dragged across difficult ground, sometimes for many kilometres. And when they had moved these stones, after all that labour, all that coordination, all that planning across seasons or even generations, they arranged them in circles, not lines, not walls, not foundations for shelter, circles. And then, in some cases, they walked away. Or they returned, season after season, for reasons we can only begin to guess at. The stones remained. They remained still. This is the mystery that draws archaeologists, historians, and anyone willing to sit quietly with an unanswered question back to these places again and again. Not because there is a single dramatic secret buried beneath the turf, not because one revelation will unlock everything at once, but because the question itself, why did they do this, opens onto something vast and patient about what it means to be human, what people have always needed from the landscape around them, and what they have been willing to give in return for something they could not hold in their hands. The geographic range alone is remarkable enough to stop you. Stone circles and megalithic arrangements appear across the British Isles, where perhaps the most famous examples stand. Stonehenge on the Salisbury Plain, the ring of Brodgar rising from the narrow land between two Orcadian locks, Callanish on the Isle of Lewis, its tall pale stones facing a horizon scored by the movements of the sun and, as more recent research has suggested, by the slow crossing paths of Venus and the rising of the Pleiades. Across the water, along the Atlantic coast of what is now France, the landscape around Carnac in Brittany is threaded with thousands of standing stones arranged in long processional avenues and tightly drawn circles, some of them erected in organised phases as far back as 4,600 years before the Common Era. And then further still, in a part of the world that Western scholarship has often overlooked when telling this particular story, more than 1,000 laterite pillars rise from the savanna landscape of West Africa, spread across a 350-kilometre stretch along the Gambia River, grouped into 93 circles or more, built and rebuilt across nearly 2,000 years of continuous sacred practice. These were not the same people. They did not share a language, or a religion, or a continuous tradition passed hand to hand across the ocean. What they shared, if anything, was something more fundamental, a set of human needs so deep and so persistent that similar forms arose independently across wildly different landscapes, climates, and centuries. Or perhaps the similarities are less meaningful than they first appear, and each tradition deserves to be understood entirely on its own terms. That tension, between the universal and the particular, runs through every serious investigation of stone circles, and it will run through this one. What archaeologists have been able to establish, carefully and with appropriate uncertainty, is that these monuments served multiple purposes, often at the same time, often changing purpose across the generations that continued to use them. Burial is part of the story at many sites. Stonehenge, for all its fame as a solar monument, was also a place of the dead. Bones were interred there across many centuries, and recent analysis has pushed researchers to take that funerary dimension as seriously as any astronomical one. The Senegambian circles are explicitly associated with burial mounds, some covering mass graves, reflecting a society that organised itself with remarkable consistency around the task of honouring its dead across more than a millennium. Memory, then, is part of the answer. The circles held the ancestors in place, kept them present in the landscape, gave the living a point of return. But there is also the question of gathering, of community made visible and structural in stone. At Carnac, excavations at a site called La Plasca have revealed not only the phase construction of standing stone alignments across a period of roughly 300 years, but also the remnants of hearths and cooking pits, evidence that people came together at these places to eat, to work, to participate in something collective. The raising of the stones was itself, it seems, an event, a social act as much as a ritual one. Sky watching may have played a role as well, at least at some sites. Solstice alignments, lunar sight lines, the careful orientation of a stone row toward a particular point on the horizon at a particular time of year, these possibilities deserve attention, even as scholars caution that the precision of many alignments may reflect symbolic intent rather than technical astronomy, and that we cannot read ancient minds from the angle of a shadow. What this investigation will not offer is a single clean explanation. The evidence does not support one. It supports instead a slow and careful movement through the landscapes where these stones still stand, a willingness to sit with what is known and what is not, to let the archaeology speak without pressing it to say more than it can. These places have been misread before, claimed by speculation and myth, and the desire for mystery to resolve into revelation. What remains, when the speculation is set gently aside, is something quieter and perhaps stranger. Real people, across real centuries, chose to raise stones in circles. The stones are still there, and somewhere in the space between the question and the silence, the investigation begins. To understand why the circle became the chosen form, not just in one region, not just in one era, but across thousands of years and thousands of kilometres of human settlement, it helps to place these monuments within the longer arc of what people in the Neolithic world were already beginning to do. Long before the most famous circles were raised, communities across northwestern Europe had begun to reshape the landscape in deliberate, labour-intensive ways. They built long mounds of earth over their dead. They constructed enclosures of timber and chalk. They moved materials they did not need to move, shaped things they did not need to shape, unless the shaping itself was the point. The earliest megalithic traditions in what is now northern France appear to stretch back to around 5,000 years before the Common Era, perhaps further, and the alignments and associated circles at Carnac and the surrounding Breton landscape are now understood, thanks to careful radiocarbon analysis, to have been erected in organised phases beginning somewhere around 4,600 years before the Common Era. In Britain, the earliest true stone circles appear somewhat later, during the Middle Neolithic, roughly between 3,200 and 2,500 years before the Common Era. These are not the origins of monumental building. They are a particular expression of something that was already, by that point, a long tradition. What made the circle, specifically, so durable a form? One possibility that archaeologists have returned to again and again is the way a circle creates enclosure without entirely closing off the world. It draws a boundary, a perimeter, a threshold that can be crossed. You can stand inside it and feel held within something. You can stand outside it and see that something is happening inside. The round form organises attention, pulls the eye inward, creates a shared focal point in a way that a line or a scattered arrangement of stones simply does not. When people gathered inside a circle of standing stones, they were not merely occupying a space together. They were occupying a space that had been deliberately made to feel different from the ground outside it. The circle said, in whatever language landscape can speak, here. This is where it happens. That sense of threshold, of a space deliberately set apart from ordinary life, seems to be confirmed by something archaeologists have noted consistently across many stone circle sites: the absence of domestic debris. No grinding stones worn smooth by the daily preparation of grain. No broken cooking vessels in the quantities you would expect from a settlement. No evidence of the small continuous accumulation of objects that gathers wherever people actually live. These were not homes. They were not workshops or storage places or convenient shelters from rain. They appear to have been cleared of the residue of ordinary existence, or perhaps they were places to which ordinary existence was never brought at all. The suggestion, cautious but persistent through the scholarship, is that the people who used these sites understood them as belonging to a different category of experience. Ritual life, not daily life. Sacred space, however that word might have been understood without a word for it. The ground inside the circle was, in some sense, not the same ground as the ground outside, and yet the circle was not built in silence or in isolation from the ordinary. The evidence from Carnac, where recent excavations have revealed hearths and cooking pits associated with phases of stone setting, points towards something more social, more physical, more communal in its making. The raising of the stones appears to have been, in itself, an occasion, a gathering of people who needed to be fed, who worked alongside one another across days or weeks or seasons, who left behind the evidence of meals shared in the effort of building something that would outlast them all. The monument and the making of the monument may have been inseparable. What was sacred about these places may have included the memory of the labour that created them. Across the full span of human history, roughly 1,300 stone circles have been identified in Britain and Ireland alone. In the savanna landscape of West Africa, more than 1,000 laterite pillars arranged into over 90 circles rise from the ground along the Gambia River, across a reach of 350 kilometres, built and maintained across what may be as many as 15 centuries. These numbers alone should give pause to any explanation that offers a single origin, a single culture, a single meaning. The circle as a form arrived, or was arrived at, independently, in different soils, under different skies, by people who almost certainly had no knowledge of each other and no shared tradition in any direct sense. What that implies is not a mystery that can be unlocked by finding the one idea that connects them all. It implies something more interesting and more difficult. It implies that the circle answered a human need that was itself nearly universal, and that the particular answers each culture gave, the specific meanings they embedded in their specific stones, were as varied as the landscapes they came from. This is the understanding that shapes what follows. Not a single story, but many stories that happen to rhyme. Not one purpose repeated across the millennia, but a family of purposes, related by the form they chose to inhabit. That ancient, patient round, open to the sky, waiting for whoever would come to stand within it. Of all the circles that have ever risen from the earth, none has attracted more sustained attention, more competing theories, more reverent silence or more passionate argument than the one that stands on Salisbury Plain in southern England. Stonehenge is, in almost every measurable sense, extraordinary. And yet the more carefully you look at it, the more it refuses to resolve into a single clear meaning. It is a monument that has been studied for centuries, excavated with care, dated with precision, examined from every angle that modern science can offer, and it remains, in the most important ways, an open question. To stand near it in the early morning, even now, is to feel the weight of something you cannot quite name. The Sarsen stones, great slabs of hard grey sandstone quarried from the Downs at Marlborough, some 25 miles to the north, rise to heights of nearly 8 metres, and were shaped with extraordinary effort using other stones as hammers. They were arranged in 2 formations, an outer ring of standing uprights capped by horizontal lintels, curving in a wide circle, and within that ring a horseshoe of 5 paired uprights, each pair supporting its own single lintel, creating the tall archway forms called trilithons. The tallest of these trilithons stands more than 6.5 metres high, and the lintels were fitted to the uprights using a mortise and tenon joint, a technique borrowed, archaeologists have suggested, from the woodworking traditions of the same communities. The stones were shaped to do something wood already knew how to do, translated into a material that would not decay. Within and around these sarsens stand a separate group of smaller stones. The blue stones, a name that comes from their cool, bluish-grey colour in wet light. These stones are remarkable for an entirely different reason. They were sourced, as far as the evidence can determine, from the Preseli Hills in southwest Wales, a distance of more than 200 miles. How they were moved, across water and over hills, remains one of the great practical puzzles of British prehistory. There were around 80 of them. The effort of bringing them to Salisbury Plain was, by any calculation, immense. Whatever Stonehenge meant, it was worth that effort. And surrounding all of this, the sarsens, the blue stones, the horseshoe of trilithons, is an earthwork that long predates the stone settings, a circular ditch and bank enclosing a ring of 56 pits known as the Aubrey Holes, named for the 17th century antiquarian who first noticed them. This outer earthwork was constructed around 3,000 years before the Common Era, making it the oldest part of the site we know of. The stones came later. The place was already set apart, already marked, already in use, before the first sarsen was raised. It is when you consider the direction the whole monument faces that one of its most discussed qualities becomes apparent. The principal axis of Stonehenge is oriented deliberately toward the solstices. At midsummer, as the sky lightens in the northeast, the rising sun appears over a single large upright stone standing outside the circle, the heel stone, and its light falls along the avenue, a processional earthwork that links the monument to the River Avon roughly 1.5 miles away. At midwinter the alignment reverses. The setting sun, moving to the southwest, slides through the gap between the 2 tallest trilithons and illuminates the interior of the horseshoe. The monument seems, in both directions, to have been built to receive this light. The solstices are not incidental to the geometry of Stonehenge. They are, in some sense, the evidence seems to point toward, written into its bones, and yet the question of what this alignment was actually for, whether it served as a precise instrument for measuring time, a calendar capable of tracking the passage of months or the arrival of seasons, is one that recent scholarship has treated with considerable caution. A 2023 archaeo-astronomical study examined the stone spacing and the overall geometry of the monument, and found that, although Stonehenge clearly and deliberately marks the midsummer and midwinter solar points, its construction is, in the study's assessment, too coarse, too imprecise in its spacing and dimensions, to function as a strict solar calendar capable of tracking individual days or the 12 months of the year. One possibility the study raises is that Stonehenge was not a clock or a calendar in any working sense, but something closer to a solar marker, a symbolic acknowledgement of the year's great turning points, rather than a tool for calculating them. The sun was welcomed, or honoured, or perhaps called upon, at the moment when the year pivoted. But the stones, for all their precision of orientation, may not have been designed to count what lay between those moments. This is an important distinction, and it is one worth sitting with. The difference between a monument that marks the solstice and a monument that measures the year is the difference between a threshold and a ruler. Both involve attention to the sky, but they imply different relationships to time, different kinds of knowledge, different purposes in the lives of the people who built them. The evidence, such as it is, seems to lean toward the threshold rather than the ruler, though scholars continue to debate the matter, and the question is not fully settled. What is less contested, and in some ways more quietly surprising, is what the site reveals when you look not at the sky above it, but at the ground within it. Radiocarbon dating of cremated remains found at Stonehenge has established that the monument was used as a place of burial from at least its earliest phase, around 3,000 years before the Common Era, and that funerary activity continued there for more than 5 centuries after the great sarsen stones were raised. The Aubrey holes contained cremations. Cremations were found elsewhere across the site. Stonehenge was, by the measure of the evidence available to us, a cemetery, and not just incidentally or briefly. Burial was a long and sustained part of what the site was. The dead were brought here, or some of them were. Whether those individuals held particular status, whether they were chosen by lineage or by role, or by some quality we have no language for, we cannot say. But they were brought here, and they were kept here, in the same ground where the stones stand. This is the complexity that makes Stonehenge so resistant to a single tidy explanation. It was a place oriented to the sun, built in phases across centuries by communities whose composition and beliefs almost certainly shifted over time. It was a burial ground. It was the terminus of a processional avenue that led to a river. It was surrounded by outlying features, the heelstone, the station stones, the earthwork bank and ditch, each of which may have served its own purpose, or reinforced the purposes of the others, or meant something we have not yet found the means to recover. The multi-phase construction sequence, which began with the earthwork around 3,000 years before the Common Era and continued through the erection of the bluestones, and then the sarsens, and then various rearrangements and additions over the following centuries, suggests a place that was never simply finished, never locked into one function and left alone. It was returned to, altered, extended, reinterpreted by generation after generation of people who must each have had their own understanding of what it was and what it was for. Archaeologists have suggested carefully and persistently that Stonehenge accommodated several overlapping purposes, ritual and commemorative and possibly astronomical roles that coexisted or succeeded one another, or were held in tension with one another in ways we may never fully understand. The monument does not yield a single reading because it was probably never a single thing. It was a landscape in itself, a place of accumulated meaning, added to and revised across the centuries the way a language is added to and revised. Not by one speaker, but by many, each one inheriting what came before and leaving something of their own. The sun still rises over the heelstone at midsummer. The dead are still in the ground. The great sarsens still frame the sky, and the question of what it all meant remains generously open. Not far from Stonehenge, close enough that the two sites share the same broad stretch of Wiltshire downland, there lies a monument so vast that a village grew up inside it centuries later, and its inhabitants simply went on living there, generations passing without fully appreciating that their homes and lanes and churchyard occupied the interior of something ancient and enormous. Avebury is, in almost every sense, a different order of monument from Stonehenge, Not more impressive exactly, but differently impressive, in the way that an ocean is differently impressive from a lighthouse. Where Stonehenge concentrates meaning into a tight vertical architecture of towering stone and precise framing, Avebury spreads across the landscape with a kind of unhurried immensity. It asks not that you stand before it and look, but that you enter it, move through it, and be absorbed by it. The outer earthwork alone is enough to make the scale plain. A circular bank rising in places to around 9 meters high encircles a ditch that was once cut even deeper into the chalk. A ring of deliberate earth-shaping that runs for roughly 1,000 meters in circumference and encloses a space with a diameter of 347 meters. These are numbers that resist easy comprehension until you walk the interior and begin to understand what it means to occupy an enclosure that large, walled not by timber or stone, but by the chalk hillsides that were hauled out of the ground and piled into ramparts by human hands, using tools made from red deer antler. Excavation has yielded those antler picks in the ditch itself, and the evidence of those digging efforts is intimate and remarkable. Archaeologists have recovered data suggesting that on a single day, 12 workers could be identified in the act of cutting the ditch, their individual rhythms of work preserved in the layering of the chalk. 12 people one day, a fraction of the effort that the whole enclosure required, and yet somehow that particular detail brings the project into human focus. There were people here. They were tired. The chalk was hard. They came back the next day and the day after that, and so did others. Within that earthwork ring, the builders raised what is now considered the largest stone circle in Britain. The outer ring of standing sarcens, the great upright monoliths of hard grey sandstone, measured 331 metres across and originally comprised around 98 stones, some of them weighing more than 40 tons, standing between 3.5 and 4 metres tall. These stones were not shaped or dressed in the way that Stonehenge's sarcens were fashioned into precise forms with mortise and tenon joints. They were chosen for their natural character, their bulk, their presence, the way they stood in the earth as if they had always meant to stand there. Archaeologists have suggested that geochemical analysis points to the westwards area, roughly 25 kilometres to the south, as the primary source for the Avebury sarcens. Moving a 40-ton stone 25 kilometres across open downland, without wheels, without draft animals of sufficient size, without anything recognisable as machinery, was not a task that a handful of people could accomplish in an afternoon. It was a task that required a community, organised, committed, and sustained across years or decades. The same community that dug the ditch, that piled the bank, that planned and marked and oriented the whole. The monument was, in this sense, as much a product of social cohesion as of physical labour. The stone circle and the earthwork that surrounds it are records not only of what Neolithic people could lift, but of how many of them were willing to lift it together. But to understand Avebury fully, or as fully as we are able to, given how much of the original monument was dismantled and buried during the medieval period, when the stones were considered objects of pagan superstition, you have to look beyond the henge itself to the wider landscape it inhabited. Avebury was not a single monument. It was the centre of a ceremonial geography that extended across the surrounding countryside in multiple directions. To the southeast, leaving one of the henge's main entrances, a double row of standing stones once stretched for 2.5 kilometres through the valley. This is the West Kennet Avenue, a stone-lined road of roughly 200 paired monoliths that linked the Great Henge to a smaller circular monument known as the Sanctuary several kilometres away. Walking that avenue, and you can still walk stretches of it today, though much of the original stone has gone, would have been an entirely different experience from approaching Stonehenge across open ground. The avenue structured movement. It created a corridor. It made the journey itself into something shaped and deliberate, a procession between two sacred places through a landscape marked and divided by stone on either side. This is one of the qualities that archaeologists have found most compelling about Avebury as a monument and as a landscape. The extent to which its design seems oriented toward the experience of movement, of traversal, of being inside a space rather than standing at its boundary. Stonehenge, for all its size and grandeur, is in some respects a monument you approach and face. Its meanings, whatever they were, seem concentrated at the centre, in the alignment of light through the trilithons, in the interior space enclosed by the rings. Avebury is a monument you enter through a gap in an enormous bank and then inhabit. You walk its circuit, you cross its interior, you leave by another entrance and find yourself on an avenue that carries you further into the wider ceremonial landscape. The experience was not, one possibility suggests, primarily about a moment of focused observation or a single dramatic event. It may have been about the extended duration of moving through a space that was designed to be passed through, to be lived in temporarily by those who came together here. The scale of that coming together is worth pausing on. Building Avebury, digging the ditch, piling the bank, transporting and raising the stones, laying out the avenue, would have required a degree of social coordination that extended far beyond a single family group or even a single settlement. It demanded people from across a wider territory, organised under some shared understanding of what the monument was for and why it deserved so much of their time and strength. The monument itself, once built, became a record of that coordination. To stand inside Avebury was to stand inside proof of what your community, your wider network of communities, had been capable of together. The sheer visible scale of the bank and ditch, the circuit of standing stones, the avenue stretching away toward the horizon, these were not only sacred spaces in some abstract sense. They were, archaeologists have suggested, assertions of collective identity, expressions of who these people were as a community, and what bound them to one another and to this particular stretch of chalk downland. The precise dates of Avebury's construction span several centuries. Radiocarbon evidence places the main henge earthworks broadly between 3,000 and 2,600 years before the Common Era, with the stone settings perhaps somewhat later, though the exact sequence remains a matter of ongoing scholarly debate. What seems clear is that the monument evolved over time, phase by phase, generation by generation, in a way that echoes what we have already seen at Stonehenge. It was not built in a single season by a single act of communal will. It was returned to, extended, and reinterpreted. The landscape around it accumulated additional monuments, long barrows, smaller enclosures, the Silbury Hill, that great artificial mound of chalk that still rises nearby without yielding a clear explanation for why it was built. The whole stretch of downland around Avebury seems to have been, over the course of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, a place that Neolithic people continued to invest in, to modify, to fill with significance. What that significance was, in its full texture and meaning, we cannot know with certainty, but the evidence seems to point towards something more than a site of occasional ceremony. Avebury, and the landscape it anchors, looks like a place that was at the centre of a world. Not the whole world, but the world of the people who built it, who entered it, who walked its avenue, who raised its stones. A place that organised space, structured time, and gave a community a shape it could stand inside. If Avebury is an ocean spread across chalk downs, then Callanish is a cluster of dark sails on a northern sea, gathered at the edge of land and water, where the Hebridean winds never seem to rest. To move from southern Britain to the Isle of Lewis is to step into a different register of landscape and of light, harsher perhaps, but also cleaner, pared back to rock and peat and sky. Here, where the Atlantic presses in from the west and the lochs lie long and silver between the hills, the Neolithic and Bronze Age builders raised a stone circle that feels at once intimate and exposed, a ring of standing figures looking out over a wide, restless world. Callanish, Callanaeus in Gaelic, occupies a low promontory above Loch Roag, its stones rooted in thin soil that has known centuries of grazing and wind-burnt heather. At its centre stands a single tall monolith, roughly 5 metres high, with a powerful, slightly leaning presence. Around it, a circle of stones, about 12 metres across, sets the heart of the monument. From this ring, stone rows radiate like the arms of a star. To the north, a long avenue of paired stones. To the south, a shorter line, and to the east and west, more modest rows that together turn the circle into a kind of cross-shaped setting, a cruciform of stone grounded in the earth. Archaeologists have suggested that, like Stonehenge and many other great circles of Atlantic Europe, Callanish is not indifferent to the movements of the sun. The axis of the main circle aligns broadly with the sunrise at midsummer, when the sun climbs out of the northeast and the day at this latitude seems to stretch almost endlessly. On that longest day, light would have poured between the stones, catching the rough gneiss surfaces, marking the turn of the year in a way that required no written calendar, only memory and repetition. In this sense, Callanish belongs recognisably to the same family of monuments that pay attention to the solstices, to those pivot points of the solar cycle that were, across many ancient cultures, moments of renewal, of gathering, of ceremony. But over the last few decades, researchers have come to suspect that Callanish's designers may have been attending to a more intricate pattern in the sky as well. The stones do not simply face the rising midsummer sun. They also, it seems, lean into other, slower rhythms, the wandering of planets, the climbing and sinking of star clusters that unfold on timescales much longer than a single year. One particular focus has been the short row of stones that stretches eastward from the central ring. It is not the grandest feature of the site. 5 stones, set in a line about 23 metres long, aiming toward a horizon of low hills and distant sea. For a long time, this row was simply one component among many, noted, surveyed, and mapped, but not given special prominence. Then, in a detailed 2021 study, scholars took another look at its exact orientation, measuring the azimuth, the precise bearing along which the stones point, and comparing it to the reconstructed sky of the second millennium before the Common Era. The numbers are arresting. The east row points not just vaguely towards sunrise, but very close to a particular direction, just under 80 degrees east of north. In the reconstructed Bronze Age sky, that is almost exactly where the planet Venus appears at sunrise on certain rare occasions. When it crosses the path of the rising sun at midsummer, these crossover events happen in a cycle of about 251 years. A long rhythm of approach and parting that would manifest over generations as something like a great return, a bright star-like light reappearing in nearly the same place on the horizon at the time of the longest day after lifetimes have passed. The same study noted something else. At 2 of these Bronze Age crossover moments, in the 1670s before the Common Era, by our modern reckoning, the Pleiades, that small glittering cluster of stars in the constellation of Taurus, were also rising in almost the same direction, their own azimuth close to the line of the east row. To stand at Callanish in those years, at dawn near midsummer, would have been to see not only the sun climbing in its familiar path, but Venus glowing close to its light, and, above or near it, the tight little swarm of the Pleiades, 3 celestial presences, the sun, the brilliant wanderer, and the tiny cluster, rising together along a line set in stone. The match between the stones and these reconstructed sky positions is not perfect. There are uncertainties in measuring both the azimuth of the row and the precise altitude of the horizon, and the dating of the stones themselves rests on indirect evidence, such as charcoal and pollen from nearby contexts. The builders may have set the row centuries before or after those specific Venus crossover events. A small shift in horizon height, a slight difference in alignment, and the apparent precision softens. The scholars who proposed the connection are careful in their language. The alignment is, in their words, suggestive. It invites interpretation, but it does not compel a single conclusion. What they do propose, though, goes beyond the idea of the stones as a simple observational device for marking midsummer dawn. Drawing on a 19th century tradition from the area, in which local informants spoke of something appearing at Callanish at sunrise on the solstice, heralded by the call of a cuckoo, the researchers suggest that an older myth may once have linked these sky patterns into a story. In some Celtic languages, the word for Venus, a bright and beautiful object in the sky, was related to a term meaning the shining one, associated with loveliness, and sometimes with a divine feminine figure. The Pleiades, arriving with or near Venus, may have been imagined as a bird-like presence, a herald, perhaps encoded in that remembered cuckoo's cry. Out of this combination of language, alignment, and folklore, the authors sketch the possibility of a mythic divine wedding enacted in the ski at Callanish, the sun and Venus meeting in brightness at the moment of the longest day, accompanied by the rising of the Pleiades in a kind of cosmic procession. In such a story, the eastward row of stones would not merely point to where the sun first appeared, but would guide the eye and the body along a narrative from the approach of the shining one at the horizon, up through the starry cluster, and into the full blaze of the solstice dawn. Ritual movement along the row toward the central monolith and its surrounding circle could have echoed that celestial joining, a human counterpart to a marriage in the heavens. If something like this lay behind the monument's design, then the astronomy of Callanish would have been as much symbolic and ceremonial as it was practical. The stones would not function as a modern observatory might, gathering precise data to calculate dates in a strict numerical fashion. Instead, their alignments would anchor stories in place. They would make the rare, slow cycles of Venus and the Pleiades feel immediate, embodied, woven into the land. Children could be told, when the bright one returns to that notch on the horizon, when the little cluster rides above it, then the great wedding in the sky is here again. The stones would stand as a permanent script for an oral narrative, a way of giving durability to patterns that play out beyond the span of a single life. This way of thinking about Callanish sits comfortably within a broader reassessment of how ancient people may have used the sky. Rather than imagining Neolithic and Bronze Age communities as proto-astronomers primarily concerned with building precise calendars, many archaeologists now emphasize how celestial events might have been folded into myth, into ritual dramas, into ceremonies that reinforced communal identity and memory. The solstice, the moon's slow turning, the rare dances of planets and star clusters. All these could be occasions for telling particular stories, for reenacting foundational events, for marking moments when the boundary between human and divine, earth and sky, felt especially thin. And yet, as with Stonehenge and Avebury, we must be careful. The stones are still and silent. They do not tell us directly what stories were spoken between them. The Venus and Pleiades interpretation rests on carefully assembled data, but the uncertainties are real. The East Rose construction can be placed only within a broad window of centuries. The alignment could be the result of an intention we no longer fully grasp, or a fortunate byproduct of a design whose primary meanings have been lost. Other explanations, a focus on a particular local hill, a now vanished feature of the horizon, a different star or constellation altogether, cannot be ruled out. What the proposal does give us, though, is a vivid example of how richly layered these monuments might have been. At Callanish, as at Avebury and Stonehenge, the circle framed the sun. But it may also have framed rarer, more elusive patterns, the long heartbeat of a planet's return, the soft shimmer of a star cluster rising from the sea, bright edge of the world, the remembered call of a bird at dawn. Standing there today, among the wind-scoured stones, it is not difficult to imagine people long ago watching that horizon with stories in their minds, seeing in the meeting of a lights not only the turning of time, but a drama of union, of promise, of renewal played out in the sky and echoed in the circle of stone below. From the Hebridean headlands of Callanish, we can drift further north and east, across colder seas, into a landscape where stone, water, and sky seem to fold into one another. Here lie the Orkney Islands, off the tip of mainland Scotland, where low, rounded hills rise from a lattice of lochs and inlets, and the wind moves almost without interruption from ocean to ocean. On one of these islands, mainland Orkney, a great circle was raised that seems at first glance almost impossibly regular, a drawn line made solid. This is the ring of Brodgar. Brodgar sits on a narrow neck of land, an isthmus held between two bodies of water, the Loch of Stennis to the south, the Loch of Harray to the north. To stand within the circle is to feel water on both sides, held just beyond the grass and the peat, reflecting whatever light the sky chooses to offer. Around this strip of ground, low hills gather in a loose ring, not dramatic mountain peaks, but gentle, enclosing slopes that rise and fall like the edges of a shallow bowl. The effect is of a natural amphitheatre, with the circle of stones set not on a commanding height, but in a carefully chosen hollow between earth and water, as if the place itself were waiting to be marked. Archaeologists date the main construction of the Ring of Brodgar to sometime between about 2,500 and 2,000 years before the Common Era. Perhaps a little earlier, if we follow some strands of evidence back toward 2,600. The dates are not fixed in the stone itself. They come instead from traces in the surrounding soil, from charcoal and fragments of pottery and other deposits that can be measured and compared. Within those broad centuries, sometime in the later Neolithic, people here decided to inscribe a perfect circle on this thin tongue of land, and to fill that circle with stone. Originally, it seems, there may have been as many as 60 stones set into the ring. Today, only 27 still stand, their companions broken, fallen, or lost. Yet the form of the whole is still clear. The circle measures about 104 metres across, a wide open space framed by uprights that, at their tallest, reach a little over 4.5 metres into the air. Around the stones runs a great ditch, 3 metres deep and 9 metres wide, carved not from soft soil but from solid rock. To cut such a ring by hand with stone and bone tools would have required immense and sustained labour. generations' worth of effort focused on drawing a single line around a single patch of ground. Unlike the great enclosures at Avebury, which wander slightly as they follow the contours of the chalk, Brodgar's geometry is strikingly consistent. Surveyors have measured its outline and found it to be very nearly a true circle, one of the most regular of all the large stone rings of Britain and Ireland. There is a sense here of deliberate, careful planning, of a community that not only wanted a circle, but wanted this particular circle, this clean, encompassing shape, set where water and hills already suggest a wider natural round. Brodgar does not stand alone. Within a few kilometres lies the Ness of Brodgar, a complex of Neolithic buildings that seems to have been a great ceremonial and perhaps residential centre. Not far away is the standing stones of Stennis, a smaller but very tall and imposing circle. To the east stands Maeshowe, a stone-built chambered tomb whose long entrance passage is aligned to catch the setting sun at midwinter. Scattered across the landscape are burial mounds, cairns, and other traces of Neolithic and Bronze Age activity. Together, these monuments form what has been called the heart of Neolithic Orkney, a dense ceremonial landscape compressed into only a few square kilometres, held between sea and loch and low hills. In this setting it is perhaps inevitable that people have looked to the sky for further meaning. Just as Stonehenge has invited readings in terms of solstices, and Callanish has drawn attention to the paths of Venus and the Pleiades, Brodgar has become a focus for those intrigued by the slower drama of the moon. In the 20th century, the engineer and archaeoastronomer Alexander Thom proposed that Brodgar and its neighbouring cairns together formed a kind of lunar observatory. In his reconstruction, the burial mounds scattered around the ring were not just places for the dead, but also backsites, fixed points that, when viewed from particular stones in the circle, allowed observers to track the rising and setting of the moon at its extreme positions on the horizon. Over the course of an 18.6-year cycle, the moon's path tilts and swings, reaching higher and lower standstills before returning to its starting place. Thom suggested that Brodgar's careful shape, its placement within this natural amphitheatre, and its relationship to surrounding mounds together, encoded a sophisticated awareness of those long, slow lunar rhythms. There is an undeniable appeal in this picture. To imagine people gathered within the ring watching the full moon lift over a particular notch in the hills or slide along the edge of distant land is to feel the monument alive with anticipation. The water in the lochs would have caught the moonlight and doubled it, turning the isthmus into a kind of glowing bridge between reflections. The regularity of the circle seems to invite the idea of measurement, of repeated observations made from the same points over many years. One possibility, then, is that Brodgar did, in some fashion, involve attention to the moon, to its slow breathing in and out along the horizon, woven into stories and ceremonies that unfolded on generational scales. And yet, as with so many astronomical readings of ancient sites, the closer we look, the more cautious we must become. Later scholars, including Douglas Heggie and Graham Ritchie, have returned to Thom's measurements and his proposed sightlines and found reasons to hesitate. The apparent precision of some alignments softens when we account for uncertainties in the original surveying, for the erosion of cairns and stones, for the difficulty of knowing exactly where an observer would have stood. The burial mounds that play such an important role in Thom's scheme are not all securely dated to the same period as the circle. Some may be earlier, some later, some reworked over time. Without firm chronological anchors, it becomes hard to be sure that the stones and mounds were designed together as a single astronomical instrument. Critics have also noted that, while the circle is impressively regular, there is little evidence, in their words, for a highly accurate and standardized unit of measurement that would allow for the kind of fine-grained predictions that a true observatory would require. The alignments Thom highlighted are often close to significant lunar positions, but not so exact that chance, or a more general desire to face a prominent hill or notch, can be confidently ruled out. The evidence seems to point towards some attention to the sky, certainly, but not necessarily to the kind of precise, high-accuracy system once proposed. What most archaeologists now suggest is a middle path. The Ring of Brodgar may well have framed certain celestial events. The high summer sun and the long winter shadows, the waxing and waning of the moon over the lochs, the appearance of bright stars over particular hills, all these would have been experienced from within that circle of stone and water and earth. The monument's placement, its amphitheatre of horizon, seems too striking to be entirely accidental. Yet its primary meaning may have been less about calculation and more about creating a charged setting, a place where sky, land and community could meet. In this view, the locks are as important as the lunar standstills. The hills that cradle the site matter as much as any particular azimuth. The neighbouring monuments, the tomb of Maeshoa catching the midwinter sun, the tall stones of Stennis rising like gateways, form a network of places that together defined a sacred landscape, one where the dead were close, the living gathered, and the movements of the heavens were folded into narratives of origin, of return, of belonging. Standing in imagination within Brodgar's ring, we can let the debate about exact alignments recede slightly, and attend instead to the atmosphere the builders created. A perfect circle cut into rock, encircled by dark water and soft hills, linked by site and path to tombs and temples and houses of stone. Whether or not its designers traced the moon's standstills with mathematical care, they certainly traced a boundary, a liminal edge where the ordinary world gave way to something set apart. Within that ring, under the slow turning of sun and moon, people could gather to remember their dead, to mark the passing of seasons, to listen to stories in which the reflections in the locks and the lights in the sky spoke to one another across the encircling stones. From the islands of Orkney, where water cups the stones of Brodgar on either side, we can let our attention drift back to the mainland and south into a different kind of amphitheatre. Here, in the north of England, the land rears up into sharper forms. Ridges and peaks fold and refold, deep valleys carve between them, and the sky is broken not by low hill lines, but by sudden dark silhouettes of mountain slopes. In one of these wide basins, at the edge of what we now call the Lake District, another circle stands, smaller than Brodgar, far more contained, yet somehow no less vast in feeling. This is Castle Rigg. Castle Rigg lies on a gently sloping plateau above the modern town of Keswick in Cumbria. Around it, on almost every side, the Cumbrian fells rise like walls, Skiddaw and Blencathra to one quarter, Helvellyn and its neighbouring ridges to another, Grassmore and the western heights beyond. From within the ring the horizon is not a simple line. It is a serrated, layered rim of stone, a mountain bowl that seems to hold the sky in place. Cloud and light move across that rim in slow, shifting bands. Mists can pour down from the passes, or lift suddenly to reveal hard, sunlit ridges where, a moment before, there was only grey. The circle itself is modest when set beside Stonehenge or Brodgar. It is not a towering ring of trilithons, nor a perfect 100-metre sweep cut into rock. Instead, it is a slightly flattened oval, about 32.5 metres across at its widest, almost 30 at its narrowest. Archaeologists count between 38 and 42 stones, depending on whether they include some of the smaller, recumbent blocks. The tallest rises a little over 2 metres, the heaviest may weigh up to 16 tons. On the northern side there is a gap, about 3 metres across, that many have taken to be an entrance, a deliberate opening in the otherwise continuous ring. Within this oval there is something unusual, a small rectangular setting of 10 low stones, offset slightly from the centre. Its purpose is unknown. It might have framed a particular activity, marked a special place, or echoed structures made of timber that have long since vanished. Whatever its role, the effect is to give the interior a sense of articulation, as if the circle were not just a blank arena, but a space with its own internal focal points. Castle Rigg is often dated, on typological grounds, to the late 4th millennium before the Common Era, around 3200 BC. No charcoal from a hearth beneath a stone, no preserved timber post trapped in a socket, gives us a firm radiocarbon date. Instead, the estimate comes from comparisons of style, from the shape of the ring, the nature of its setting, and its relationship to other early monuments. If that broad estimate is correct, then Castle Rigg belongs among the earliest stone circles in Britain. It stands, in that sense, closer in time to the first experiments with stone rings than to the later, more elaborate constructions of Wessex. Here, more than at some other sites, the surrounding land seems to do much of the work that banks and ditches or massive uprights do elsewhere. There is no great encircling earthwork here, no rock-cut ditch like Brodgar's. The boundary is made by the stones themselves and by the bowl of mountains beyond. To step into the ring is to step into a compass made of peaks. Every direction is marked by a different rise, a different profile. The shoulder of Helvellyn, the long back of Skiddaw, the twin horns of Blencathra catching the last low light of evening. It is perhaps not surprising, then, that archaeologists and skywatchers alike have looked to the horizon as closely as to the stones. Several possible alignments have been noted. At the time of the autumn equinox, the sun appears to rise in the direction of a low hill called Threlkeld Knot, a few kilometres to the east, and some observers have suggested that particular stones frame that point on the skyline. Other suggestions link parts of the ring to the midwinter sunrise, or to notable lunar positions as the moon reaches its more extreme risings and settings along the mountain rim. Yet, as so often, the closer we examine these possibilities, the softer their edges become. The suggested axes are not razor-thin beams of geometry but broader, looser sight lines. The equinox sunrise does indeed lift near Threlkeld Knot, but not with the tight precision we might expect if the circle had been constructed as a finely calibrated solar calendar. The stones that could mark winter sunrises or particular moonrises do so approximately rather than exactly. Scholars who have surveyed the site note these correspondences, but also warn that in such a crag-bound landscape, any line of sight will inevitably meet some distinctive feature of the horizon. The evidence seems to point toward something subtler, not an instrument of exact measurement, but a place where sky and land were brought into dialogue. One possibility is that certain times of year, the balance of day and night at the equinoxes, the low arc of the sun near midwinter, the swelling of the moon to full brightness over a particular saddle in the hills, were noticed here, anticipated and remembered, without requiring a grid of angles and units. The mountains themselves offer ready markers. A child could be told, when the sun rises over that notch we will begin, or when the moon climbs along that ridge it is time to, and the story or ritual or journey would unfold from there. In this view, Castle Rigg's power lies as much in its placement as in any particular alignment. The choice to build here, in this natural amphitheatre of fells, turns the entire horizon into part of the monument. The ring of stones does not so much impose a new form on the land as complete a form that is already suggested by the surrounding peaks. The circle is a mediator, a low, human-height echo of the greater circle of mountains and sky. Compared with the massive engineering of Carnac or the geometric perfection of Brodgar, Castle Rigg's architecture feels almost restrained. There are no monstrous lintels, no rock-cut trenches. Instead, the drama is supplied by distance and elevation, by light sliding along valley floors far below, by clouds snagging and releasing on summit after summit. At different seasons, the same stones are surrounded by very different worlds. Snowline dropping down the flanks of Helvellyn, summer haze softening Skiddaws' outline, autumn storms throwing bands of shadow across Blencathra's face. The ring stays constant, while everything around it changes. This constancy amid change may be part of the circle's meaning. Archaeologists have suggested that, like many such sites, Castle Rigg probably served as a gathering place. Its open interior, its lack of enclosing banks, its prominent yet accessible position above a natural routeway through the valleys, all hint at people coming together here, from different directions, out of different valleys, along paths that would each bring a different sequence of peaks into view. We can imagine groups arriving at twilight, as the last light catches the high ridges, or at dawn, with mist pooled in the lower ground, and only the higher silhouettes clear against the brightening sky. What was done within the ring we cannot say with certainty. There are no rich burials here, no clear evidence of feasting middens like those around parts of the Carnac complex. If fires were lit, their ashes long since sifted into the soil. If offerings were made, they are gone. What remains is the enduring relationship between stone, place, and horizon. It may be that the circle's role was less about administering a precise calendar and more about anchoring shared experiences in memory. To stand together at an agreed time within this oval of stones and watch the sun breach a particular gap in the hills, or the moon drift over a certain peak, would be to stitch that moment into a fabric of stories and expectations that could be carried away and recalled. In that sense, Castle Rigg is a reminder that not every stone circle needs to be understood as a kind of prehistoric observatory. Some, like Stonehenge, clearly encode deliberate solstitial lines. Others, like Callanish, seem to draw in more complex celestial narratives, perhaps involving Venus and the Pleiades. But there is room, too, for monuments whose cosmic charge comes not from tight geometry, but from presence, from their position in a landscape where the sky is already dramatic, and from the simple fact of people returning, year after year, generation after generation, to share that drama together. Here, the circle's measurements matter, but they do not dominate. The slight flattening of its oval, the spacing of its stones, the size of its entrance all contribute to the feel of the place, but they work in concert with the greater measurements written in the distances between mountains, in the height of the fells above the valleys, in the breadth of the sky cradled within that jagged rim. Castlerigg suggests that the power of a monument can emerge as much from choosing the right place and letting that place speak, as from inscribing abstract patterns into it. As the light fades in our imagination over the Cumbrian peaks, and the circle darkens into silhouette against a dimming sky, we are left with an image of Neolithic people who understood, deeply, the emotional force of a horizon. They did not need to master trigonometry to feel the weight of the equinox sun lifting over Threlkeld Knot, or the long winter dusk sliding down the flanks of Helvellyn. By placing stones where they did, they gave those recurring sights a frame, a stage, and invited their descendants to remember. From the bowl of mountains in Cumbria, we can let that imagined dusk deepen, and then drift westward in our thoughts, across the narrow seas, to another edge of Europe. Here, on the Atlantic coast of what is now Brittany, the land has a different character. Instead of high fells and folded valleys, there are long, low ridges running roughly parallel to the shore, streaks of granite and schist emerging from sandy soils. The air carries salt even far inland, and on many days the light seems to come not only from the sun above but also from the wide reflective sheet of the ocean to the west. Scattered across this peninsula is one of the most remarkable megalithic landscapes in the world, the stone alignments and circles around Carnac. For centuries visitors have walked among row after row of weathered menhirs, hundreds of them, tilting slightly in well-worn pastures, and wondered who could have raised so many weights of stone, and why. Early antiquarians spun legends of ancient armies turned to rock, or of Celtic priests fixing the march of the stars. Modern archaeology has added more careful maps and measurements, but for a long time the deep origins of this landscape remained hazy. In recent years, however, a quiet excavation at a place called Le Plasca, near the modern commune of Pluharnel, has begun to sharpen the picture. Le Plasca is not one of the famous postcard-ready alignments. There, the great standing stones themselves are gone. What remains are their traces, the foundation pits in which they once stood, the stones that once wedged them in place, and the marks of activity around them. It is in a way like finding the footprints of a vanished monument. Archaeologists working at Le Plasca have identified a sequence of occupation stretching across roughly 3 centuries in the 5th millennium before our era, from around 4600 to 4300 calibrated BC. Through almost 50 radiocarbon dates, taken from tiny flecks of charcoal in hearths, cooking pits, and the fills of stone sockets, and then combined using careful Bayesian modelling, they have pieced together a relative chronology in which the alignments did not spring into being all at once. Instead, they seem to have grown in stages. In the lower layers there are traces of a tomb, an early focus for attention in this patch of ground. Later, pits appear that held upright stones, aligned in rows. Later still, other fire-related features cut into or abut the earlier ones, suggesting moments when people returned, modified, expanded, and perhaps redefined the place. Across 6 main phases of activity, 3 involve the actual setting of stones. The others cluster around them, in time and in space, with evidence of burning, cooking, and deposition. It is important to say, though, that these dates are not the same as marks on a builder's plan. The charcoal that gives us numbers for our timelines comes from fires, not from the stones themselves. A fragment of hazel or oak sapwood caught in a cooking pit tells us when that fire burned. It does not, by itself, tell us exactly when the neighbouring menhir was levered upright. The association between feasting and stone-raising seems strong, but it remains inferential. The stones at Le Plasca are no longer in place, and we glimpse their story through the negative spaces they left behind. Even so, the details of those foundation pits hint at the sheer effort involved. Many of the sockets are nearly 2 metres across. In their bases and sides, archaeologists found clusters of large granite blocks, each weighing over 100 kilograms. These were the chocks and wedges used to brace taller uprights, stones perhaps 3 metres high, so that they would stand secure against gravity and time. To lower such a mass into a prepared hole, to pack it around with dozens of heavy stabilising stones, would have required more than a handful of people. It suggests coordinated labour, planning, and the kind of shared knowledge that comes from doing something again and again. Around these pits, at La Plasca, the ground is pitted with hearths and cooking areas. Microscopic study of the soil and residues has shown that these were not just small family fires. The pattern points toward large-scale cooking, the rendering of fats, the repeated preparation of meals on a scale beyond ordinary daily life. One possibility is that these were communal feasts, gatherings that accompanied the work of quarrying, hauling and raising each new section of the alignment. We can imagine, perhaps, people arriving from scattered farmsteads inland, following paths along the ridges to this coastal plateau. Over years and decades, even over generations, they would have seen the rows of stones lengthen, one season's labour adding a new segment to what was already there. Each episode of building may have been framed by its own cycle of fires, meat roasting, grain being parched, pots simmering with stews thickened by whatever the land and sea could offer. The smoke would have drifted low across the fields, mingling with the sea mist, the surfaces of newly raised stones still pale against the older lichen-darkened uprights. In this way, the construction itself begins to look less like a purely practical task and more like a sequence of rituals, repeated but never entirely the same. The setting of each menhir would have been a moment, ropes taut, voices calling to coordinate the final pull, the rush of movement as the base slid into place and the weight settled. Around that moment, there would be formalities we can only dimly guess at, words spoken, gestures made, perhaps offerings buried in the fill of the pit before it was sealed. Then, afterwards, the shared eating, the talk, the retelling of how this stone, like those before it, had been persuaded into its upright stance. Because the activity at La Plasca stretches across centuries, the site also speaks of memory. Each new phase was not a fresh start on blank ground. It was an addition, an adjustment, a re-engagement with what had gone before. Children would have grown up seeing their elders work on stones that their grandparents had first raised. The alignments they knew were not a finished plan executed in a single generation, but a living structure, open to extension, re-emphasis, even partial abandonment. To come back time after time to dig into soils that already held the ghosts of old pits and old fires was to enter into a relationship with the past as tangible as any ancestor's bones. Carnac, in this light, becomes not just a forest of inert monoliths, but a record of repeated gatherings, of labour turned into story. The rows and circles we see today are the endpoints of many journeys with ropes and levers, and of many evenings when, under Atlantic skies, people warmed their hands at shared fires after a day of straining together against stone. The evidence from La Plasca suggests that, here at least, the making of the monument was itself part of what the monument was for, a rhythm of work and feasting through which a scattered community could recognise itself, again and again, in the act of raising stones from the earth. If we step back from this one Breton field and let our attention widen, a pattern begins to emerge that is not confined to Carnac alone. Wherever we find great rings and ranks of stone, we also find, in one form or another, the traces of organised effort, quarries opened, routes prepared, tools shaped, fires lit to feed the people doing the work. The stones, for all their stillness, are the tips of very large, very human icebergs. Quarrying is where much of this begins. At La Plasca, the granite for the vanished menhirs seems to have come from outcrops more than 2 kilometres away. It is not a great distance by modern standards, but when each rough block, each future upright, weighs more than 100 kilograms, and many stand 3 meters high when set, it represents a substantial undertaking. Someone had to choose which lumps of bedrock would do. Someone had to know how to lever them free without shattering them. Others had to organise the teams that would drag them across uneven ground, perhaps on wooden sledges, perhaps on rollers, perhaps with the help of wet, slippery clay. At other monuments, the distances and weights were greater still. The sandstone pillars of the Senegambian circles, for instance, were hewn from laterite, a tough, iron-rich stone, using iron tools, and then fashioned into near-identical cylinders or polygonal shafts. Many stand close to 2 meters tall and can weigh up to 7 tons. More than 1,000 of these pillars were raised in 93 groups, spread along some 350 kilometres of the Gambia River Valley, over a span of roughly 1,500 years. The details of transport in that landscape are different from those of Atlantic France, but the implications are similar. To extract, shape and move so many heavy, regular stones was not a job for isolated households acting alone. It points instead to a web of obligations and arrangements, to leaders who could call on labour, and to craftspeople whose skill was recognised and passed on. Archaeologists sometimes use the phrase monumental labour for such work, but that term can sound dry, as if we were merely counting person hours. When we think about the people themselves, it becomes more textured. Those who quarried and hauled and raised the stones knew the ache of shoulders and backs, the sound of ropes tightening, the slip of a sledge beginning to move. They knew the small dramas when a block jammed in a hollow, or a lever snapped and had to be replaced. They knew the relief of setting a heavy stone down safely, and the pride of seeing it join a growing line, or close another arc in a circle. Feasting in this context becomes easier to imagine not as an optional extra, but as part of the mechanism that made such projects possible. At La Plasca, the big hearths and cooking pits, set deliberately alongside the lines of stone sockets, hint at meals on a scale that went beyond the everyday. The soil chemistry and burnt residues suggest repeated heating of large volumes of food, the rendering of fats, the kind of sustained cooking that can keep a crowd fed for many hours. We cannot say, with certainty, that every fire was part of a festival, or that every cut of meat was shared out with ceremony. Yet when archaeologists compare such features with ethnographic accounts from other societies, a consistent pattern emerges. Large communal works are often bound together by large communal meals. Feasts are more than an opportunity to eat well. They are occasions where social ties are made visible. In many cultures, those who contribute more food or who host more people gain prestige. Promises can be exchanged and remembered, marriages discussed, grievances smoothed over. When the work is hard and the tasks are long, the promise of shared food at the end of the day, or the knowledge that one's efforts will be publicly acknowledged in front of kin and neighbours, can be a powerful incentive. In this way, the hearths beside the stone pits at Carnac are not just signs of calories burned. They are also clues to conversations, to shifting alliances, to the maintenance of a social fabric. Something similar seems to have unfolded, in a different key and over a much longer period, along the Gambia River. The Senegambian circles were not built in a single burst of enthusiasm. Radiocarbon dates stretch from the 3rd century before our era into the 2nd millennium after, suggesting that, generation after generation, communities returned to the same kinds of places, quarried the same hard stone, shaped it to a familiar pattern, and stood it upright in association with burial mounds. To sustain such a tradition for 1500 years implies not only technical knowledge, but also a shared sense that this was the proper way to honour the dead and to mark the landscape. Every new circle, every addition to an existing group would have echoed previous gatherings, previous efforts, both remembered and half-remembered. In both these regions, and in others like the chalk uplands of southern Britain, or the windy isthmus of Orkney, the building of stone monuments can be seen as a way of creating shared memory. The finished circle or alignment is impressive, of course, but the process of making it is itself a story that people could tell and retell. A child who watched their parents heave on a rope to raise one of the stones at Avebury, or help tamp the earth around a newly set pillar in Senegambia, would carry that memory into adulthood. Years later, when they returned to the site for another episode of building, or for a ceremony held within the completed ring, they could point to a particular stone and say, in essence, I was there when that one went up. Over time, such memories accumulate and overlap. Some are precise. This is where your grandfather slipped and broke his ankle. That is the stone that nearly fell the wrong way. Others blur into a more general sense that our people did this, that we have always come here, that this place is ours. The monument becomes a fixed point around which stories can orbit, and because the monument is made of stone, enduring far longer than any wooden hall or woven fence, it offers a kind of stability that human lives cannot. Monument building also seems to have played a role in shaping social order. To organise dozens or hundreds of people in coordinated tasks is to exercise authority, whether formal or informal. Those who planned the sequence of work, who decided which stones would go where, or who presided over the feast that accompanied the labour, would naturally occupy positions of influence. The stones, rising visibly from the earth, could thus become physical expressions of hierarchies negotiated in more subtle ways. Who stands where in a procession? Who speaks first? Who is entitled to invite others to eat? At the same time, the collective effort required for such works may have helped to bind together communities that were otherwise scattered. In Neolithic Western Europe, farms were often small and dispersed, households relatively self-sufficient. In the Senegambian hinterland, villages looked out over different stretches of savanna and riverbank. To bring people from these separate units into periodic cooperation, whether to raise a new ring, to add stones to an avenue, or to refurbish an old burial cluster, would have been to renew alliances that might otherwise fray. The regular return to a familiar sacred landscape, every few years or every generation, provided opportunities to reaffirm old agreements and to forge new ones. In this sense, the circles and alignments are less like isolated sculptures and more like the visible surfaces of recurring events. Each phase of building at Carnac, each new cluster of laterite uprights along the Gambia, each enlargement or repair at a place like Brodgar or Avebury, sits at the end of a chain of preparations, decisions made, messages sent, food gathered, paths cleared. The stones stand still, the human lives around them move, converge, disperse, and then, at some later moment, converge again. It may be that, for those who first conceived these projects, the gatherings themselves were at least as important as the final static result. A ring of stones is a durable thing, but the act of coming together to make it, of labouring side by side, of sharing food and drink, of speaking with people one might otherwise rarely meet, creates bonds that are both less tangible and more immediate. The monument is what remains when everyone has gone home. The community, in some sense, is what is made and remade in the shadow of the rising stones. When we walk among these circles now, centuries or millennia later, our attention is naturally drawn to what we can see. The grey uprights at Stonehenge, the leaning pillars at Carnac, the rust-red cylinders of the Senegambian fields. Yet beneath our feet, and in the layers of soil and memory that archaeology teases apart, there is another story running alongside the questions of ritual and belief. It is a story of work organised on a remarkable scale, of meals cooked for many mouths, of alliances renewed through shared endeavour. In the quiet of the night, imagining those distant days, we can allow the stones to fade a little in our mind's eye, and listen instead for the murmur of voices around the fires, the creak of ropes, the soft thud of earth being packed in around a newly raised pillar. The mystery of these monuments lies not only in what they might have signified once they were complete, but also in what they did to the people who made them. By asking many hands to move in concert, by weaving labour and feasting into a recurring pattern, they turned the landscape into a kind of social loom. With each stone lifted from the ground and fixed in place, threads of kinship, obligation, and shared identity were drawn a little tighter, binding communities together across both space and time. As communities returned, again and again, to these places of shared effort, another layer of meaning settled around the stones like fine dust. The circles did not stand only for the living who had raised them, or for the alliances renewed in their shadow. Increasingly, across many regions and many centuries, they also became tangled with the memory of the dead. Archaeologists sometimes speak of burial landscapes, rather than individual graves, to emphasize that the resting places of the dead often form patterns on the land. Long barrows strung along a ridge, clusters of round mounds overlooking a river, cremation pits tucked into ditches and banks. These are not random. They create zones where the presence of ancestors is concentrated, where stories about lineages and origins can be anchored to the ground. Again and again, when we map such landscapes, we find stone circles and earth rings at their heart. Stonehenge is perhaps the clearest case. It is easy, in the popular imagination, to see it mainly as a kind of prehistoric observatory, a place where the midsummer sun is framed between great trilithons. Yet the soil around those famous stones has yielded a quieter, more intimate record. Radiocarbon dates from cremated bone show that, long before the larger sarsens were raised, the site was already being used as a cemetery. The earliest known remains, placed in the circular Aubrey holes around 3000 BC, seem to mark the start of a tradition that continued for roughly 5 centuries. Later, more cremations were tucked into the encircling ditch and bank, added in phases over hundreds of years. We do not know the names of these people, or the precise reasons why their ashes were brought here rather than scattered or buried at home. But the pattern suggests that Stonehenge was not simply a stage for observing the sky. It was also, for a long time, a place where the dead of a particular community, or perhaps a line of leaders, were gathered together, generation after generation. Each new burial would have required a journey, a decision, a set of small rituals. Each would have reinforced the notion that this ring of the earth and stone was where the important dead belonged. Nearby at Durrington Walls, the traces of timber circles have prompted an intriguing idea. Wooden posts rot and fall, stone remains. Archaeologists have suggested that, in this landscape, timber might have been associated with the transience of the living, while the permanence of stone marked the enduring realm of the ancestors. If so, then moving from the busy seasonal settlement at Durrington, full of feasting debris and ephemeral structures, to the silent stones of Stonehenge might have been, in itself, a ritual journey from the world of the living to that of the remembered dead. The circle becomes not just a meeting place, but a threshold. A similar intertwining of stone and ancestors can be traced at Avebury. Here the great ring of Sarsens, and the avenues that once unfurled from it like stony arms, stand in a landscape already thick with earlier monuments. On a nearby ridge lies the West Kennet Long Barrow, where the bones of at least 36 individuals were placed and rearranged over time, their remains mingled in the cool interior. Centuries later, as Bronze Age people continued to inhabit and revisit this area, they added hundreds of round barrows, small burial mounds that cluster along the skyline and in some cases nestle close to the standing stones themselves. It is as if each succeeding generation wanted to stitch its own dead into the fabric of a place already dense with ancestral presence. To walk across that chalk in, say, 1500 BC would have been to move through a countryside where almost every prominent rise held a mound, where the great stone circle loomed as a kind of ancestral amphitheatre, and where stories could link particular graves to particular lines of descent. The circle gathers not only the living bodies that assemble within it, but also the remembered bodies whose remains lie around it. Along the Gambia River, in West Africa, the association between stone and burial is, if anything, more explicit. The Senegambian stone circles, over 1,000 laterite pillars in 93 groups, stand in close partnership with earthen tumuli. Excavations show that many of these mounds contain burials, sometimes rich with grave goods, and that they were constructed and reused over a span of some 1,500 years, from the 3rd century BC into the 2nd millennium AD. Not every circle has a fully explored mound, and the details vary from site to site, so archaeologists are cautious about drawing a single neat picture. Yet the overall pattern is clear. Again and again, in this region, people marked the dead with upright stones, returning to the same clusters, refurbishing, adding, thickening the weave of memory. Here too the circle can be imagined as a kind of hinge between worlds. To stand among those rust-red pillars, with the low earth mounds beside them, is to be in a space that has been used, over and over, to mediate between the living community and those it regarded as significant ancestors. Names and precise lineages have long since vanished, but the enduring stone keeps the fact of connection visible. Where the soil might level and grass might regrow, the pillars continue to say, something happened here and kept happening for a very long time. Across these varied landscapes, the chalk plains of Wessex, the rolling downs around Avebury, the savannas and river banks of Senegambia, the circle appears not only as a device for gathering people or framing the sky, but as a durable frame for memory itself. Human recollection is slippery. Stories change as they are told and retold. The details of who did what and when blur within a few generations. But a ring of stones is stubborn. It outlasts the lifespans of those who raised it and those who follow them. It offers a fixed outline into which each new group can pour its own meanings. In this way, stone circles may have helped to stabilize memory across time. They gave communities somewhere concrete to point to when speaking of our ancestors, even when the specifics of those ancestors had faded. They tied lineages to particular hills and river bends, made kinship not only a matter of blood and story, but also of place. To belong to a group was to know which circle you returned to for rites of passage, which ring of stones watched over the remains of your dead. Standing at the edge of such a circle, then, would have meant more than simply stepping into a cleared space. It would have been a crossing into a zone thick with invisible company, where the living came under the gaze of those who had gone before. The stones, quiet and unmoving, formed a boundary that could be crossed and recrossed, but not ignored. Within their arc, songs might be sung, oaths sworn, offerings laid down, acts performed, always, in the awareness that one's own brief life was set within a much longer chain. We cannot recover the full emotional weight of those moments. We can only glimpse their outlines, in the arrangements of graves around circles, in the careful orientation of mounds and stones, in the sheer effort devoted to sustaining these sacred landscapes over centuries. Yet it seems likely that, for many who approached them, stone circles were not only markers in space, but also doors in time, places where the living could feel themselves linked, for a while, to the deep, shadowy company of their ancestors. Along the lower reaches of the Gambia River, where the land opens into savanna and the air carries the smell of dust and waterweeds, that chain of memory becomes almost overwhelming. Here, within a band of countryside only about 100 kilometres wide, more than 1,000 pillars of deep red laterite rise from the soil in 93 separate groups. They are clustered into 4 great concentrations, Senegambian and Wana to the north, Wasu and Kerbach to the south, strung out along some 350 kilometres of river, like beads on a long, winding thread. From above, many of these groups resolve into small, tidy rings. Each circle is compact, often only 4 to 6 metres across, made up of 8, 10, sometimes 14 pillars. The stones themselves stand roughly the height of a person, 2 metres or so, and can weigh as much as 7 tons apiece. Yet they are not the rough, naturally tapered blocks we might see at Carnac or Avebury. These are carefully shaped laterite columns, their flanks deliberately smoothed and trued with iron tools. Their colour, when freshly cut, must have been a vivid, almost glowing red, fading over time to a softer rust that still catches the light at dawn and dusk. At the feet of these orderly rings lie low, rounded mounds of earth. When archaeologists opened some of them, they found burials, human bones, sometimes intact, sometimes disturbed and reorganised, pots, iron objects, beads and other grave goods. Not every mound has been excavated, and the details vary from site to site, but a consistent pattern emerges. Again and again, the circles stand in close relationship to tumuli that were built, reused and embellished over long stretches of time. This is not a landscape of isolated graves. It is a landscape where the dead have been drawn together into enduring nodes of attention, around which the living must have circled in their turn. Radiocarbon samples from these funerary contexts give us an outline of the chronology. The earliest activity seems to begin around the 3rd century BC, while the latest dates fall in the 15th or 16th century AD. For more than 1,500 years, in other words, communities along this stretch of West Africa devoted labour, skill and care to raising and revisiting these circles. We should be cautious here. The dates come from organic material within the mounds. They tell us when bodies were interred or rituals performed, but they do not always mark the exact moment each pillar was levered upright. Some stones may predate their associated burials, others may have been added into an already active sacred place. Even so, the overall impression is of a tradition that endured, altered and renewed itself over many human lifetimes. To sustain such a tradition, to quarry and carve so many massive blocks, to move them into place and lift them in precise arrangements, required more than occasional bursts of effort. It points toward a prosperous, highly organised society, capable of mobilising labour on a regular basis, and of maintaining shared understandings about where and how the dead should be honoured. The uniformity of the pillars, their consistent height, their neat circular plans, speaks of craft specialists, of quarrying knowledge passed down, of agreed standards, and perhaps of authorities who could oversee and coordinate the work. Yet for all this order and scale, we cannot attach a single neat name to the builders. The circles belong to a distinct West African cultural context, not an extension of the megalithic fashions of Atlantic Europe. There is no evidence that ideas or masons travelled here from Britain or Brittany to plant a familiar form in foreign soil. Instead, we are looking at a tradition that grew from local conditions, from the societies that farmed and traded along the Gambia, from the beliefs and lineages that threaded through them. Modern scholars have suggested possible links to Sera communities, or to Sos or Mande-speaking peoples, but the evidence is fragmentary, and oral histories do not reach cleanly back across 2 millennia. Archaeologists therefore speak more broadly of Senegambian circles, as a way of acknowledging both their regional coherence and the cultural complexity that lies behind them. What matters, in this quiet, nocturnal view, is less the precise ethnic label, and more the way these monuments knit together land, memory and community over an astonishing span of time. Each cluster of circles and mounds marks a particular portion of the riverbank as special. as a place where the living and the dead met under the open sky. Generations who never knew one another in life were nonetheless drawn to the same rings of stone, to add new burials, to tend old ones, to perform whatever rites bound their kin to the ancestors already present. If we stand back from the details and simply think of the time involved, the mind begins to drift. A child brought here in the 1st century AD to watch a funeral or to participate in a seasonal ceremony would have walked between pillars that were already old, perhaps several centuries in place. That child, grown grey-haired, might return to bury a grandchild beneath those same stones, or to be buried there themselves. Centuries later, other families, speaking related but not identical languages, keeping some different customs, would still be threading the same paths between the circles, reading meaning into the same red columns. In this way, the Senegambian stone circles stand as a quiet counterpoint to the better-known rings of Britain and northern France. They remind us that the impulse to raise stones in circles, to create enduring arenas where the living and the dead, the earth and the sky, can be brought into relationship, is not the property of any single region. The form may echo, a ring of uprights, a partnership with burial mounds, but the story here is its own, rooted in West African soils, in laterite and iron and riverlite. To drift through this landscape in the mind is to feel how many different paths human beings have taken toward the circle, and how many different meanings they have poured into its unbroken line. When we place these West African circles alongside the stone rings of Britain and the long alignments of Brittany, a certain temptation arises. The shapes seem to rhyme across oceans and millennia. A ring in Senegal, a ring in Orkney, a ring at Avebury. Surely, the mind whispers, they must all be doing the same kind of work. Surely there is one deep explanation that will unlock them all at once. But the more closely we look, the more that comforting idea unravels. In Brittany, at Carnac, and at the newly studied stretch of La Plasca, the story starts startlingly early. Radiocarbon dates from hearths and cooking pits threaded among the foundations suggest we are in the 5th millennium BC, around 4600 to 4300 Cal BC, when farming was still a relatively new way of life in Western Europe. Long rows and clusters of menhirs march across the landscape, each stone heaved into place at the cost of heavy labour. Excavations there have uncovered scorched earth, charcoal, the discarded traces of feasts. It seems that whatever meaning the stones held, they were bound up with gatherings, with coordinated work and shared meals, with the forging and reaffirming of community at particular spots in the land. In Britain, many centuries later, a different pattern comes into focus. At Stonehenge, in the chalk of southern England, the circle is tied not only to the sky, but also to the dead. Within and around its ditches and banks, in the centuries after about 3100 BC, archaeologists have found cremated remains of perhaps 150 to 240 individuals, making it the largest known cremation cemetery in Britain for that time. The great sarsen trilithons and the imported bluestones were aligned so that on certain days, most strikingly at midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset, the sun would appear to stand framed by the stones. Yet recent studies have questioned the idea that this was a precise calendar in stone. The geometry seems too rough for a strict counting of days. The numbers once thought significant may owe more to modern numerology than to Neolithic intent. Here the evidence seems to point instead toward a place where light and darkness, life and death, ritual, procession and burial all intersected, without resolving neatly into a single function. Far to the north, at the ring of Brodgar in Orkney, another variation appears. This is a perfect circle more than 100 metres across, raised between locks, ringed by low hills, embedded in a dense ceremonial landscape of mounds, cairns and other stone structures. Archaeologists date its main phase to around 2500 to 2000 BC, broadly contemporary with the later stages of Stonehenge. Some researchers have suggested that Brodgar's line of sight picks out the rising or setting of the sun at solstices, or the extremes of the moon's wandering every 18.6 years. Others counter that the alignments are too many, the hills too irregular, the intention too elusive. The site is often described as enigmatic, and even sympathetic studies admit that its astronomical purpose, if any, may always remain enigmatic. It is a circle in a landscape saturated with meaning, but not one that yields up a simple label like observatory or temple. And then, on another continent entirely, the Senegambian circles speak in yet a different register. They rise not from chalk or granite, but from laterite, quarried and shaped with iron tools, their surfaces carefully smoothed. Their dates span not a few centuries but some 1,500 years, from the 3rd century BC into the 15th or 16th century AD. Instead of standing alone on open downland, they are intimately tied to burial mounds, to graves reopened and added to long-lived sacred precincts revisited over and over by communities whose languages and customs slowly changed. The circles here are part of a funerary landscape in West Africa. In a world of iron, long-distance trade, and complex social hierarchies distinct from the small farming villages of Neolithic Britain or Brittany. When we set these three regions side by side, what emerges is less a single story than a family of resemblances. The chronology does not line up. Carnac's alignments belong to the 5th millennium BC, many British circles to the 4th and 3rd, Senegambia to a span that stretches deep into the historical era. The materials differ: rough granite and other local stones in Brittany, massive sarsens and bluestones on Salisbury Plain, laterite pillars along the Gambia. The social worlds behind them are not the same. The builders of Stonehenge lived in a landscape of early farmers and pastoralists with no metal tools and no writing. The communities of Senegambia were part of a world that knew iron smelting, complex regional networks, and, in later centuries, the shadow of written records from neighbouring regions. If we then try to force a single explanation across all these settings, to say for instance that all stone circles are observatories, or that all are primarily cemeteries, or that all are political theatres, we find the evidence tugging away from us. Stonehenge has solar alignments, but its story is also one of cremation, of the careful gathering of the dead. Carnac shows traces of communal feasting amid its stones, but the precise role of the sky there is unclear, and any calendar function remains speculative. Callanish, in the Hebrides, seems to catch the rising of Venus and the Pleiades in a way that suggests a specific mythic narrative, a kind of divine meeting in the heavens, while other circles nearby might be oriented to more modest horizons or local features. In Senegambia, the tight, repeated association with burial mounds and ancestor veneration makes it difficult to see the circles primarily as astronomical instruments, even if certain alignments might exist by chance. Here, the ring seems first and foremost a frame for the dead, a way of drawing attention to specific graves and binding them into a longer chain of place and kinship. The similarities in form, the recurring choice of the circle, of upright stones defining an interior, may tempt us to imagine a single origin or a shared guiding idea carried from place to place. Yet there is no good evidence that masons from Carnac sailed to Britain to instruct its builders, or that knowledge somehow leapt from Atlantic Europe to West Africa. It may be that human beings in very different times and places, faced with the same basic materials of earth and sky, of memory and gathering, simply found their way to a similar shape. A circle of stones is an effective way to mark off a special space without shutting it in. It can cradle the dead, focus a feast, frame the rising of a star, or give a community somewhere to stand together. Because our evidence is fragmentary, bones and pots here, a hearth there, a line of sight that might or might not have mattered, we have to approach these monuments with a certain humility. Archaeologists can suggest possibilities, stack up probabilities, and show us where the arguments grow thin. Radiocarbon dates can sketch broad windows of time, but not always the exact season when a stone was raised. Patterns in alignments can hint at intention, but we cannot, without written testimonies, be entirely sure what people thought they were doing when they checked a sightline against the horizon. To accept that there is no single explanation for stone circles is not to admit defeat. It is to recognise that the past was as various as the present, and that similar forms can flower from different soils of belief and need. A ring of stones in Brittany may have gathered farmers for feasts and seasonal rites. A ring in Wiltshire may have guided processions between the living and the dead. A ring along the Gambia may have held the quiet authority of generations of ancestors sleeping beneath it. Multiplicity is not a weakness in this story. It is part of its depth. It reminds us that when we look at these circles, we are not looking for one master key, but listening for many overlapping voices, faint but persistent, circling through the dark. If the circle was never just one thing, the sky above it was never just one thing either. Stand at Stonehenge, at Callanish, at Brodgar, and it is hard not to feel the pull of the heavens. The uprights rise like fingers pointing upward. The gaps between stones frame slices of horizon where something might appear. There is an instinctive sense that these places are in conversation with the movements of sun, moon, and stars. Yet as soon as we try to turn that feeling into firm explanation, the ground begins to shift beneath our feet. At Stonehenge, the temptation is strongest. The axis of the great trilithons and the avenue that leads away from the circle line up strikingly with the midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset. On those days, if the weather cooperates, the sun seems to roll along the edge of the horizon and lift or sink into the frame of the stones, as if acknowledging the architecture. For much of the 20th century, this seemed like the key. Stonehenge as a kind of vast stone calendar, a device for counting days and predicting seasons with great precision. But in recent years, archaeologists and archaeoastronomers have re-examined the evidence with cooler eyes. When they measure the positions of the stones, the angles of the ditches, the irregularities of the horizon, they find that the geometry is impressive, but not surgical. The alignments to solstice sunrise and sunset are real, but the layout does not show the fine-grained regularity one would expect from a precision instrument. A 2023 study emphasised that for all its power as a symbolic marker of turning points in the year, Stonehenge is a coarse tool if we imagine it tracking days like a modern calendar. Its long use as a cemetery, holding the cremated remains of many individuals, suggests that the drama of the rising or setting sun there was woven into a web of meanings about death, return, and renewal, rather than limited to the practical needs of farmers counting off the seasons. Far to the north and west, at Callanish, the sky speaks in a slightly different register. Here, a tall central stone stands within a ring, and from it avenues of stones run out like the arms of a cross, one stretching eastward. For a long time, visitors have noticed that the monument engages with the summer solstice sun, whose light pours along the avenues in a particular way. But a recent, more detailed study has traced another more subtle pattern. The eastern row of stones points not exactly to the solstice sun itself, but to a narrow band of horizon where, every 251 years or so, the planet Venus crosses over the rising sun at midsummer. Around the same time as one of these rare crossover events in the 2nd millennium BC, that line of sight also captured the rising of the Pleiades, a cluster of stars that in later folklore has been linked to the call of the cuckoo, the herald of spring. To some scholars, this convergence looks deliberate. They have suggested that the builders of Callanish may have encoded in stone a story of a divine meeting in the heavens, the bright planet and the sun, the starry cluster and the seasonal bird, a kind of celestial wedding that marked not just a date but a myth. Yet even here, with such an evocative fit, caution is needed. The alignments work within a degree or two of arc, a level of precision that may or may not have been meaningful to the naked eye. The dating of the stones and the dating of the specific sky events must be reconstructed from charcoal, pollen, and models of past orbits. The picture is plausible, even compelling, but it remains a possibility rather than a solved puzzle. Around the ring of Brodgar on Orkney, the sky becomes more elusive still. The circle sits nestled among lochs and low hills, its horizon broken and varied. Some researchers, walking the ring and peering over the ridges, have seen in those outlines the extreme positions of the moon. It standstills every 18.6 years, when it climbs higher or lower than usual in the sky. They have plotted lines from stones to hilltops and suggested that Brodgar was a place where the moon's long, slow breathing could be watched and perhaps celebrated. Other scholars, using the same survey data, have drawn gentler conclusions. With so many hills and so many stones, they argue, it is easy to find apparent alignments after the fact. When those alignments are tested statistically, when one asks, for instance, whether more lines point to significant lunar positions than would be expected by chance alone, the signal becomes faint. Some candidates survive scrutiny, others fall away. The result is not a neat blueprint of a lunar observatory, but a tangle of possibilities that refuses to resolve into certainty. This is, in many ways, the challenge of archaeoastronomy across the whole Atlantic facade. To test whether a stone circle is really key to the heavens, researchers measure the azimuths, the compass bearings of particular stones or avenues, and compare them to where the sun, moon, or planets would have risen or set on the ancient horizon. They build computer models, apply statistical methods, and ask whether there are more meaningful alignments than we would expect from a random scatter. Yet the sky is generous with patterns, and the land is not neutral. A small shift in where one stands, a slight change in the shape of the horizon, a fraction of a degree here or there in the data, can change which celestial body appears to be hit by a given line of sight. Many proposed alignments fall within 1 or 2 degrees of a target, close enough to be intriguing, but perhaps not close enough to prove intent beyond all doubt. Selection bias lurks in the background. If we choose to notice and publish only those circles that seem to match a solstice or a standstill, we are already filtering the evidence. Because of this, a growing number of archaeologists suggest that we may be asking the wrong kind of question if we look only for precise observational programs. Sun, Moon, Venus, and star clusters did not need to be tracked with great exactness to be powerful. A solstice sunrise framed between stones, even with a degree of leeway, could mark a time of gathering and remembrance. A rare appearance of Venus in a particular part of the dawn sky could anchor a story told around hearths, repeated to each new generation as a way of knitting together people, place and time. The Pleiades could carry associations not just with a calendar date, but with the return of birds, the mood of the season, the presence of unseen beings. Under this view, the sky at these circles was as much a symbolic canvas as a clock. Celestial events could have carried ceremonial and mythic weight that we can no longer fully fathom, their meanings rippling through songs, taboos and rituals now lost. An alignment does not have to function like a modern observatory to matter deeply. It may have been enough that at certain moments the heavens seemed to answer the stones, that a path of light or a particular star rise confirmed that one was standing in the right place, at the right time, in the right company. The debates that swirl around these interpretations are sometimes presented as a problem, as if disagreement meant that the stones were refusing to speak. But the uncertainty is part of what makes this landscape of circles so rich. Different scholars weigh the same measurements and come away with different emphases. One sees a careful watching of the lunar cycle, another a looser framing of significant directions, another still a primary focus on burial or feasting with the sky as a resonant backdrop rather than a strict guide. Instead of erasing the mystery, each new study adds another layer to it. A solstice line at Stonehenge that is real but not exact. A Venus and Pleiades story at Callanish that may have glowed in the minds of its builders. A web of possible lunar sites at Brodgar that hovers between chance and intention. When we read the sky with caution, we do not strip these circles of wonder. We simply allow that the people who raised them may have held many things together at once. The turning of seasons, the movements of luminous bodies, the presence of ancestors, the bonds of the living, all circling through stone and darkness and time. If trying to read the sky through these circles is difficult, trying to read time through them is no easier. The stones themselves are patient but uninformative. Granite, sandstone, laterite, gneiss. They do not carry a built-in clock. A block of sarsen at Stonehenge, a pillar at Carnac, a laterite cylinder in Senegambia may have lain in the bedrock for millions of years before someone levered it upright. When we ask, when did this circle begin? The stones give us no direct reply. So archaeologists turn instead to the softer, more fragile things that the circle makers left behind. Charcoal from a hearth, a fragment of bone, a seed from a fire-darkened pit, a scrap of burnt twig trapped in the fill of a post hole. These things once belonged to living organisms. They contain carbon that was part of the atmosphere at a particular moment. When that life ended, the carbon clock in each fragment began to tick. Radiocarbon dating is the craft of listening to that ticking. In the laboratory, the tiny remains are cleaned, ground, burned, turned into gas or graphite. Their atoms are counted, the ratio of unstable to stable carbon measured. From that ratio, scientists can estimate how long it has been since the organism died, and then use calibration curves, built from tree rings, corals, and other archives, to translate that estimate into a calendar date, expressed as a range rather than a single year. A date might come back as around 2900–2800 calibrated BC, or sometime between the 5th and 3rd centuries BC. One such date, taken alone, is like a single voice humming in the dark. Archaeologists collect many. They excavate around the stones, sampling foundation pits, hearths, ditches, and graves. Dozens of dates accumulate, each with its own uncertainty. To make sense of this chorus, they now often use Bayesian modelling, a set of statistical tools that allow known sequences. This pit was dug before that hearth, this burial lies below that stone setting. to sharpen the broad radiocarbon windows into narrower spans of time. At Carnac, along the windswept coast of Brittany, this approach has transformed a general impression of great age into a more finely resolved story. In a sector known as La Plasca, archaeologists collected 49 samples of charcoal from the fills of foundation pits, from cooking pits, and from an older tomb that lay beneath later activity. Fed into a Bayesian model, these dates fell into 6 distinct phases, and the phase in which the great alignments of standing stones were raised could be placed between about 4,660 and 4,250 calibrated BC. The stones themselves could not be dated, but the activities tight around them, digging, backfilling, lighting fires, roasting food, left a temporal halo that the model could read. At Stonehenge, something similar has been done with the dead. Cremated human bones, recovered from the ring of pits known as the Aubrey Holes, and from the ditch around the first earthwork enclosure, have been radiocarbon dated and then woven together with Bayesian methods. The results suggest that the site served as a place of burial for around 5 centuries, from roughly 3,180 to 2,965 to 2,830 to 2,685 calibrated BC. That range does not tell us when the famous Sarsen trilithons were set in place, nor the exact moment when the earlier bluestones were first arranged within the circle. It speaks instead of a long pulse of funerary use, a community returning again and again to this chalk plateau to burn its dead and lay their ashes within the earthworks. In Senegambia, along the Gambia River, where laterite pillars stand in red-brown rings, radiocarbon dates cluster very differently. Here, charcoal from associated burial mounds and organic traces in pottery point to activity from the 3rd century BC all the way to the 16th century AD. Over 15 centuries of intermittent use, generations shaping and reshaping a sacred landscape, returning to old circles, building new ones, adding mounds, reopening graves. The dates trace not a single act of construction, but a long durée of memory and obligation. In all these cases, the key detail is easy to miss. The dates come not from the stones, but from what happened beside them, under them, or around them. At Carnac, it is the charcoal in the foundation pit, fills and hearths that anchors the alignments in time. At Stonehenge, it is bone in pits and ditches. At Senegambia, it is material sealed within mounds. The stones are silent witnesses. The organic debris of human life provides the timestamps. This creates a subtle ambiguity. A hearth dug next to a newly raised stone may well belong to the celebration that followed its erection, but it might also belong to preparations made a season earlier, or to a ritual held decades later at a place already marked by older monuments. A burial placed at the foot of a pillar could be contemporary with its raising, or could represent a later community claiming an ancient circle as its own. Even a foundation pit can be deceptive. An old tree root hollow reused as a stone socket could yield charcoal centuries older than the act of megalith building, a problem archaeologists refer to as old wood. Bayesian models help to sift through these possibilities. They can flag outliers, dates that seem too old or too young for their archaeological context, and they can use the stratigraphic order of layers to constrain what is plausible. When a model fits well, as at Carnac's La Plasca, the overall story gains clarity. There is strong support for the idea that the alignments belong firmly in the middle of the 5th millennium BC. But even then, the model delivers intervals, not instants. It can say that the stones were probably raised sometime within a few centuries, perhaps within a few generations, but not on which particular year, let alone which particular day. At places like Callanish and Brodgar, where similar methods are applied to charcoal in stone settings and to organic layers sealed beneath banks and ditches, the same pattern emerges. The modelling sharpens our sense that these monuments belong to the later Neolithic, that they participate in a wider wave of circle building around the North Atlantic, yet the precise relationship between a given radiocarbon date and the exact moment a stone was levered upright remains, to some degree, a matter of interpretation. This is what dating can and cannot reveal. It can tell us that Carnac's avenues were standing when many parts of Europe still knew no farming at all. It can show that Stonehenge was already a place of the dead centuries before its great trilithons framed the solstice sun. It can trace a sacred landscape in Senegambia that endured for more than a millennium and a half. It can group circles into broad generations and suggest sequences of building, reuse, and abandonment. What it cannot do, except in the rarest of cases, is fix the act of construction to a single moment in time, a night of hauling ropes and shouted commands, a dawn when the last stone finally met the sky. The dates we have are close companions to those moments, but they never quite touch them. There is always a small gap where we must imagine. For a story told in stone, this lingering blur is perhaps fitting. The people who raised these circles were not working to our standards of timestamp and record. They built into the deep time of their landscapes, thinking in lifetimes, in ancestor chains, in cycles of moon and season. Our calibrated curves and statistical models allow us to approach their world more closely than ever before, to see patterns that would otherwise be lost in the mist of ages. But they stop short of dissolving the mystery completely. The circles remain anchored in time but not pinned to it. They sit within ranges and phases rather than exact dates. Their history is composed of overlapping intervals of use and remembrance. Between our numbers and their stones, there is room left for uncertainty, and within that uncertainty, the quiet, enduring sense that some parts of their story are meant to be approached gently, rather than fully possessed. So we find ourselves, at the end of this long arc of dates and models and probability curves, standing once again inside the simplest thing of all, a ring of stones. For all the complexity that surrounds them, the basic shape hardly varies. Whether it is the careful, near-perfect circle of the ring of Brodgar, encircled by its ditch of rock and water, the broad enclosing sweep of Avebury, with its banks and inner rings, the cruciform arms of Callanish stretching out from its central ring, the dense alignments of Carnac gradually resolving in places into rounded groups, or the low, red-brown circles of laterite pillars along the Gambia River, the same geometry returns. A loop, a boundary without corners, a way of drawing a line that has no obvious beginning and no end. Archaeologists have suggested that this shared form is not a coincidence of engineering, but the heart of the matter. In the Neolithic landscapes of Britain, henges and circles seem to represent a new kind of arena. Spaces set apart from fields and houses, dedicated to gathering, ritual, and perhaps decision-making. To walk through a gap in the bank or step between two great stones was to cross a threshold. The ring enclosed not only earth, but a community's attention. A circle offers continuity. Follow its curve and you will return to where you began, though the world will have shifted a little while you walked. Many scholars think this made it a powerful way to think about time, the passing of seasons, the waxing and waning of the moon, the cycle of life and death. At Stonehenge, midwinter and midsummer alignments hint at a concern with the turning of the year, yet the careful geometry stops short of the precision needed for a strict calendar. At Callanish, the east stone row seems to engage not only with the summer solstice sunrise, but with rare moments when Venus crosses paths with the rising sun near the Pleiades, events that occur on a long, slow beat measured in years and decades. One possibility is that such alignments did not simply mark dates, but expressed a story about a cosmos that regularly renews itself, celestial beings meeting and parting in a sky that forever circles. The stones themselves make those abstractions solid. Set in a ring, they freeze a motion that is otherwise invisible. The sun lifts, arcs and falls, the moon glides and changes shape, stars swing along their nightly paths. People are born, grow old, are buried. The circle holds steady. It is, as some writers have put it, a symbol of permanence within an eternally recurring cosmos. The ring does not move, yet everything that matters seems to circulate through it. At the same time, a circle protects. Inside the banks of Avebury, within the ditch at Brodgar, or among the close-set pillars in a Senegambian cemetery, the outside world is held at a distance. There is sky overhead and earth underfoot, but the enclosing form makes a distinct inside, a place where speech is different, where actions carry weight. The repetition of this form across so many landscapes suggests that people found in it an intuitive way to separate the ordinary from the charged, the everyday from the sacred. This enclosure is not just spiritual, it is social. Archaeologists have argued that such circular monuments help create identity. They do this slowly, through repeated acts. A generation hauls the stones into place, straining together on ropes and sledges, roasting food at hearths like those at Carnac's La Plasca, eating and drinking in the shadow of newly raised pillars. Their children return for ceremonies, for feasts, perhaps for funerals. At Stonehenge, the ring of cremation burials points to centuries of such returns. In Senegambia, radiocarbon dates show communities maintaining and reusing their circles for over 1,500 years. Ancestors are laid at the feet of the stones, or within the same sacred field. Stories are told about who is buried there, about who built the ring, about why this patch of ground is theirs. In this way, the circle anchors memory. A mound or a lone standing stone can do this as well, but a ring has the added quality of gathering people face to face. Stand in a circle, and you are aware of everyone else around its edge. No one is hidden behind a corner or at the head of a long hall. The geometry is egalitarian. It can turn a group into a visible whole. Over time, that feeling of shared presence, under an open sky, against a backdrop of enduring stones, sinks into a community's sense of itself. The monument becomes a fixed point in a flowing world, a guarantee that some things remain. Yet for all this, our understanding of what any particular circle meant to its builders remains partial. We trace alignments to solstices and standstills, but, as at Brodgar, the evidence for fine-grained astronomical precision is debated. We model phases of construction at Carnac and around the Gambia, but the exact occasions that drew people inside the rings elude us. We infer ancestor veneration from burials and offerings, but the stories told aloud there about deities, animals, heroes, or spirits are gone. Digital surveys, satellite imagery, statistical models, even simulations of ancient skies have brought these places into sharper focus. They allow us to map every stone at Callanish, to test how often Venus would have risen in just that gap, to reconstruct ancient horizons now obscured by trees or buildings. They show us, with impressive certainty, that the Senegambian tradition of stone circles endured for over a millennium, that the Neolithic builders of Britain and Brittany were capable surveyors and determined organisers of labour. But there is a level beyond which all this clarity refuses to go. We can say that circles connected earth and sky, that they were theatres for collective action, that they structured memory and belonging. We can suggest that the form itself carried ideas of cycles and return. What we cannot do is translate these things into a complete, final explanation that would satisfy every question. This circle was built for this precise purpose, and for nothing else. The ambiguity is not simply a failure of evidence. It seems woven into the way these monuments operate. A circle is open. It contains and connects. It does not point to a single answer. A ring of stones can frame the midwinter sunrise and at the same time host a funeral, a feast, a treaty, a mythic reenactment of a story about the stars. Its power may lie precisely in its ability to hold many meanings at once, and to let those meanings change as new generations step inside. As we let our own thoughts move around these ancient rings, it may be worth accepting that this lingering uncertainty is part of their enduring pull. The circles stand at the meeting point of earth and sky, geometry and emotion, knowledge and unknowing. They offer us continuity, but they do not resolve everything. Instead, they invite a quieter stance, to walk up to the edge of what we can know, to recognise the limits of excavation and analysis, and to rest for a moment in that soft, unanswered space. In the hush that gathers inside a ring of stones at dusk, when the wind drops and the sky begins to darken, the questions themselves start to feel less urgent. The circle does not insist on being solved. It simply endures, holding its shape as light drains from the horizon, waiting to be visited again and again across the turning of nights and years. And so we leave the questions where they belong, circling quietly around the stones, never quite closing. If you think back over the places we have visited tonight, a pattern begins to emerge, not as a straight line, but as a weave. At Stonehenge, the great Sarsen trilithons lean toward midsummer and midwinter, yet their geometry, for all its care, does not resolve into a precise instrument of timekeeping. Around and between those alignments lie the burials, layer upon layer, telling us that the circle was as much about the dead as about the sun. At Callanish, the long east-west avenue does not simply greet the solstice dawn. Its careful orientation seems to catch rare crossings of Venus at sunrise, and the rising of the Pleiades, hinting at a story about celestial unions, about beings in the sky who meet and part on a rhythm longer than any single human life. Further south at Carnac, radiocarbon dates and the scatter of hearths and cooking pits show that people came back for centuries to work, to eat, to raise more stone. Whatever stories they told about the alignments of those rows and clusters, the evidence seems to point toward feasting and labour as central acts, the slow, repetitive work of making a landscape sacred by inhabiting it together. On Orkney, the Ring of Brodgar sits at the centre of a dense ceremonial complex, its near-perfect circle echoing in nearby tombs and structures. Archaeologists have suggested that its lines of sight may have engaged with the long cycle of the moon, but the precision of any such intent remains disputed. What is clearer is that Brodgar was part of a network of places where people gathered, processed, watched, and remembered. Across the sea, along the Gambia River, the Senegambian stone circles mark a different, later tradition, yet one that rhymes. Here, more than 1,000 pillars of laterite stand beside burial mounds, raised and re-raised from the 3rd century before our era into the 2nd millennium after. Over 1,500 years, communities return to these fields of stone to lay their dead, to reorder the ground, to reaffirm that this stretch of earth and sky belong to them. The circle, again, becomes a way to hold ancestors, to trace a boundary of care. When we draw these threads together, one possibility is that the enduring power of stone circles lies not in any single function, but in their ability to hold many at once. Astronomy, burial, ritual, labour, and sacred landscape do not compete here. They overlap. A ring can frame the rising of the sun or the slow wanderings of Venus, while also enclosing graves. It can host communal work and feasting, as at Carnac, and at the same time mark out a domain of myth. It can tie a people to their dead, like the circles of Senegambia, and still open their attention upward to an immense turning sky. Archaeologists, working with fragments of bone and charcoal, with alignments tested against reconstructed horizons, can suggest these layers. They can show us that dates stretch across centuries, that building took place in phases, that no single moment or meaning explains it all. But the closer we look, the more the circles resist being reduced to one simple story. The evidence seems to point toward complexity, monuments that could be used differently at different times, that could mean different things to different groups, yet remain recognisably themselves. For us, drifting at a distance of thousands of years, that refusal to settle can be strangely gentle. The stones do not demand that we choose between calendar and cemetery, between temple and meeting place. They offer instead a spaciousness in which all of these possibilities can coexist, like faint constellations sharing the same patch of sky. If you have found a kind of calm in wandering among these ancient rings tonight, you're welcome to come back. There are other landscapes to cross, other questions to approach and leave unanswered. When you are ready, you can subscribe or simply return, and we'll walk again through the half-light of history, unhurried, following the slow paths of rivers, roads, and stars. For now, imagine the circles as they are at this very moment, scattered across their hills and plains and river terraces. At Stonehenge, the great stones standing against the chalk, their shadows pooled in the dew. At Callanish, the tall, weathered pillars on their Hebridean ridge, listening to the wind. At Brodgar, the ring encircled by water and low hills, its stones catching glimmers of a northern sky. At Carnac, rows fading into darkness, each pillar a memory of hands and ropes and firelight. In Senegambia, low red-brown uprights keeping watch above the resting dead, as they have done for generations upon generations. Night gathers around them, as it has for 5,000 years and more. Stars wheel above, the moon thins and swells, planets shift their slow positions, seasons turn, languages rise and fall, stories are forgotten and told anew. The circles remain, quiet outlines against the dimness, holding their places between earth and sky. You can let them stand there in your mind as you drift. Rings of stone in the darkness open to the heavens, rooted in the soil, their meanings layered and unresolved, their silence deep and patient. They do not hurry, they do not explain, they simply endure, keeping watch through the long, soft hours of the night,